So the title of this video is not what you think it's about. It's actually about what type of podcast I actually love to listen to. You might have thought this video was about me making a podcast. Indeed, I'm not making my own podcast. So in this video, I'm actually going to talk about podcasts because recently I started listening to a lot of different podcasts, and I actually want to talk about what type of podcast I actually listen to, because maybe you'll learn a thing or two about my taste, and maybe you'll learn a thing or two about what I like, and maybe you'll actually pick up on my taste, and maybe you'll want to listen to these for yourself. So this is good, call it common knowledge on what type of podcast I actually listen to. So recently I started listening to many more podcasts, and I'm actually getting addicted to listening to podcasts. I actually find in my normal everyday life I'm starting to listen to more podcasts than I am music, just because podcasts give you value throughout your life and throughout your day. It just makes sense that I would rather listen to a podcast, at least for now, right now, than songs I may have listened to for 100 or maybe thousands of times that don't really give me any value besides entertainment. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about the different types of podcasts that I listen to on a daily basis. And hey, if you have any recommendations for what type of podcast that you think I'm going to like based off of my recommendations or based off of the podcasts that I listen to, leave them down in the description below, and I'd be glad to check them out. Now, the types of podcasts that I actually listen to on a day-to-day basis really don't vary from what I talk about on my YouTube channel. So I do listen to things like tech podcasts and video game podcasts. Mainly, there is some other stuff thrown into the mix, but for the most part, like I said, I listen to tech podcasts and I listen to video game podcasts because that's what I'm super passionate about. That's what I love in my life. So those are some things that I absolutely love in my life. So without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about the types of podcasts, or what types of podcasts I actually listen to. Now, keep in mind, before I talk about these podcasts, a lot of these podcasts are going to be very popular podcasts, so you can pretty much find them on any podcast application, whether it's on iOS or Android, or if you're on Windows or Mac, you can find these easily. The one nice thing about a lot of the podcasts I actually listen to is the fact that a lot of the podcasts I actually listen to do have a YouTube counterpart, and a lot of these are flat out YouTube channels. But in my opinion, I do think it's better to listen to a lot of these as audio podcasts instead of video podcasts, since the style of these videos are just quite too long. They're 40, 50 minutes to an hour, and it just makes sense you would want to listen to these as audio form instead of video form. But hey, if you don't want to listen to them in audio form, you can listen to these podcasts in video form, and you can watch these on YouTube, because 99% of these do have a YouTube counterpart, so keep that in mind. Now, the first one on my list is going to have a YouTube counterpart, and the one I'm actually talking about is the Kinda Funny Cast. So they do have two different podcasts when it comes to Kinda Funny Games. Kinda Funny Games Daily and Kinda Funny Games Cast. Those are the two. Pick your poison. Which one do you want to listen to? Now, the guys behind Kinda Funny Cast were originally IGN members. One of the main guys who actually started Kinda Funny Games is actually Greg Miller. You may know Greg Miller from IGN from way back in the day. Now, I know a lot of people out there don't necessarily like Greg Miller from IGN, but for me personally, I do like Greg Miller. But you do got to realize he is kind of comical. He is a character himself, so I understand why some people just flat out will not like Greg Miller. And he also has another host on the show, a co-host, and his co-host is also from IGN, and you probably recognize him from IGN. But the main guy from Kinda Funny Games is Greg Miller, so keep that in mind. You either like him or you hate him. But for me personally, that's where I get a lot of my gaming news. I get a lot of my gaming news from Kinda Funny Games Cast and Kinda Funny Games Daily. Pick your poison there. I love everything about that. I know Greg Miller is a fanboy, I think, of Xbox, or I think PlayStation, but he does cover things like Nintendo and things like that. So he's not strictly just one console. He does vary his things from what he likes to talk about. He talks about different things from Xbox to PlayStation to Nintendo Switch. Overall, I like the vibe that he gives off. I like the fact that he pretty much tries to cover everything. If you love gaming specifically, then you're really going to love Kinda Funny Games. Just look up Kinda Funny Games. They do have a YouTube counterpart, like I said, and for the most part, they do strictly talk about games in this podcast. They don't really stray too far from gaming. So if you just want a podcast strictly related to gaming specifically and about different platforms when it comes to gaming, Kinda Funny Games is going to be the way to go, in my opinion, and I love everything about it. But just keep that in mind. Greg Miller does run this podcast or this show called Kind of Funny Games. Now, the next one on my list is going to be a Nintendo-specific podcast specifically. So if you're not a Nintendo fan, you probably want to skip this one. The one that I'm actually going to be talking about is NVC, and this one is called Nintendo Voice Chat. And Nintendo Voice Chat also does have a YouTube counterpart. They're actually a group of IGN members who just sit around a round table and talk about the latest Nintendo Switch news or the latest Nintendo news specifically. And overall, I love the vibe that they do give when they talk about their stuff on the NVC or Nintendo Voice Chat. Now, I know a lot of people hate IGN for a lot of different reasons. A lot of their team members may not know what they're talking about. I know a lot of people hate IGN reviews. Some of their reviews are off. They rate games wrong and whatever the case may be. But for me, personally, I don't necessarily flat out hate IGN. I kind of do like IGN, but I understand that sometimes IGN is not the best place to go to when it comes to your news and things like that. And honestly, there's probably a better podcast for Nintendo-specific news, but I personally love NVC, Nintendo Voice Chat, and I listen to them all the time. And it's strictly just about Nintendo-related information about the Nintendo Switch, the Nintendo ecosystem, everything about Nintendo, whether it's rumors and things like that. If you love Nintendo, then definitely check out Nintendo Voice Chat. Again, just keep in mind that Nintendo Voice Chat is ran by a whole bunch of IGN members, so take that as it is. Now, the next one on my list is actually not even a tech-related podcast or not even a video game-related podcast. This one that I'm actually about to talk about is called Lore, and this one's basically a guy who just sits in front of a microphone and pretty much talks about all these ghostly and haunted stories. But the main reason I love Lore, if you don't know anything about Lore is kind of a popular podcast, but the main reason I love Lore is because, first of all, I love haunted stories. I love hearing all these creepy stories about just different things. It's hard to explain each individual podcast because each individual podcast is definitely very different from one another. But overall, I love the presentation of this. I love everything about this podcast. I also love the guy who runs this podcast, just the way he talks, the way everything flows. I love everything about it. And even if you're not a person that loves haunted ghost stories, you may want to give Lore a try because this guy, in my opinion, deserves all the support he can get. He's a flat out amazing human being. I love everything about him, and he pretty much makes all these different stories. And if you haven't checked out Lore, he already has like 100 and some episodes, so he's been doing this for a very long time, for many years. Definitely give out Lore a chance. The name of the podcast is LORE. That's the name of it, and you can pretty much find this podcast anywhere. Now, this is one podcast on the list. I must admit, it's not actually have a YouTube counterpart as far as I'm aware. Correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I'm aware, there is no YouTube counterpart. But if you want to listen to Lore, it is pretty much on any popular platform that does give out podcasts, so keep that in mind. Definitely love Lore. And then actually, I only have one more on the list in this video. Like I said before I talk about this one, if you have any recommendations, again, leave them down in the description below, and I'm willing to check out all your recommendations. And they don't necessarily have to be video game related or tech related. They can be pretty much anything. If you find them interesting or you think I'm personally going to like them as a person, then definitely leave them down in the description. But the last one on my list is solely tech related. There are a whole bunch of them out there, like Tech of Today or something like that. I know one by Leo Laporte, I think it's called. That one's one of the most common ones. I'm not saying his name correctly, and I'm not saying the podcast name correctly, but the one that I personally listen to on my actual podcast listening app, I actually listened to a fairly recently new one. So this one is going to be a very new one, and you may not even heard of this podcast altogether. It's actually called Lou Later. Now, if you know Lou actually runs a very successful YouTube channel called Unbox Therapy, and Unbox Therapy is flat out an amazing YouTube channel. And if you're in the technology space, then you definitely want to check out Unbox Therapy. Most likely, if you watch me or you watch YouTube and you're big into tech, then you definitely know who Lou is from Unbox Therapy. But he recently has a new channel. Actually, fun fact, if you didn't know this, you may think that just all those videos just sprung up. That's not actually the case. He's had the channel Lou Later for quite some time. It used to be one where he used to do a lot of music related stuff like hip hop, R&B, rapping, and things like that on this Lou Later channel. But basically, he turned this Lou Later channel into a strictly a podcast for tech, anything related to tech, and that also includes gaming. So pretty much anything that's tech related or gaming related is going to be on the Lou Later channel. Now, the way he does his content, it just makes more sense to listen to it in a podcast form, and that's pretty much how I listen to his content. I pretty much listen to Lou Later as a podcast in my ear. I love everything about Lou Later, or Lou specifically. I think Lou is an amazing human being. I love just the way everything flows when he talks. I love everything he has to say. It's very important to me, and that's why time and time again, I always go back to Lou to get all my technology fixes. I will admit some of his podcasts are just a little bit too long for my taste, so a lot of time I do have to skip around. There is some stuff I'm not interested in because these podcasts are very long. I'm talking 40, 50 minutes, sometimes even over an hour, and they're just very long to digest. So I'm sure even if you're very passionate about tech or very enthusiastic about technology, I'm sure there'll be something on Lou Later you just flat out will not like. But overall, I do like Lou. I do have to make this clear. Sometimes he does branch away slightly from tech and slightly from the gaming in his podcast. So pretty much anything that Lou is passionate about, he will start to stray a little bit away from the main topic of the actual podcast itself. So keep that in mind as you're watching Lou. It's not strictly about tech and strictly about gaming, so just keep that in mind. And then at the end of the show, Lou actually goes over people's comments, so people can actually write to Lou specifically, and if they want their answer answered, Lou tries to answer questions that fans actually send him, and that's where a lot of different things that people want to know specifically about his life other than tech or other about gaming, they can actually try to ask him personally, and that's where you really know more about his life. So tech, gaming, things that he's passionate about. If you want to know more about his life, overall, it's a flat out an amazing podcast. I love Lou Later, and that pretty much summarizes all the podcasts that I listen to on a regular basis. If you have any recommendations, again, leave them in the description below. I would love to hear your opinions of what type of podcast. If you listen to any podcast that you would recommend for me to listen to, again, they don't have to be strictly gaming related or tech related. Anything that you think I'm going to like, leave in the description below, and that pretty much sums up every single podcast that I currently listen to. Anyway, guys, this is Wayne from My Tech News, signing out.